Britain had promised Palestine to to two different groups directly, and they had teased France a little bit too. So the Arabs had been promised Palestine during the war. And I clicked post and like, let's see what the fuck happens. And then October 7th, because at the time it was pretty taboo to talk about, and channels would get demonetized for it. Like it wasn't really clear how or why until I had researched it, how or why we weren't. It was like kind of a quiet, subtle conversation.
On a broad level, though, when you say like they seem fucked up, what kinds of things?
So what I found, and there's sort of multiple layers to this, because there's the kinetic warfare that happens between Israel and Palestinian, elements. And then there's the propaganda and information war that happens between Israel and the rest of the world's minds, so to speak, about what's happening there. And certainly, yeah, like Iran and Hamas and like the terrorist elements, although that word itself is propaganda, I would argue.
Not for all of them, though.
No, not for all of them, not by any means. What I mean by that is that you could just as easily classify a lot of the Israeli actions as terror as you could a lot of the...
I understand what you mean.
You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
And like a lot of the people that founded Israel were classified as terrorists by Israel once it was founded, because the whole world was so fucking pissed about things like the bombing of the King David Hotel that originally
Can you tell people what the Irgun did?
Yeah, so what I wound up finding was, and this is obvious, like this is broad strokes. And there's lots of nuance and lots of it I don't understand yet, that I'm always trying to learn more. But the Zionist movement began in the sort of international Jewish discussion that before Israel was a thing, right? At the time, the land of Palestine was like a British protectorate, more or less, right?
Right.
And at the time, they were throwing out, like, Zionism was not popular among all Jews by any means. There was lots of very cogent arguments against it. And some that I would argue I wish had won out. And I think it would have been better for the Jewish people in the long run, I'm not a Jew, obviously. So I don't have skin in the game.
I didn't know that.
Not my place to speak about it in that regard. But I think that there's serious long-term downsides to having a Jewish state, actually, that we'll talk about.
The Jewish state where it is, or in general?
Both. I think there's a second layer to where it is, though there's obviously a benefit to where it is too, in terms of like that is their homeland, like that is the homeland of their religion and of their people. But there's also the element of like, we were talking earlier off camera about how like actually some people were throwing out regions of Africa of like maybe
they wanted a piece of Uganda.
Yeah,
yes.
Maybe we should put a Jewish state in Uganda. Right?
That would have made. Now, obviously, there's always going to be issues anytime a group of people, no matter who they are, is trying to like establish a state where there isn't one.
Colonize.
But still, you can imagine 95% of the quote unquote problems we have wouldn't exist if it wasn't this particular piece of land. Yeah. You know what I mean?
And at the time, there's lots of reporting from all different outlets that use the word colonize very specifically and directly to say like the Jews going to colonize Palestine. Not in a derogatory or evil way, just saying like that's what's happening. Like the Jewish people are deciding to move to Palestine and build a settlement, build a home there. And there's tons of nuance in terms of how that happened. And there was lots of violence that started to spark a little bit. But at the time, like it wasn't like my understanding is that in general, the Arabs weren't like, get the fuck out of here, we hate you. Like Jewish people already lived there. Christian people already lived there.
In the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, exactly. And even the 10s and the O's, right? Like in 1900 era.
Yep.
Because they were just moving in and they were just doing their own thing in their little conclaves, just doing their thing, right?
It's just more of them came after the Balfour Declaration.
Exactly. And so it's important to remember that the idea of Israel is not a retaliation to the Holocaust. The idea of Israel is before the Holocaust, and it completely predates the Holocaust, and it's tragic and horrific. But the propagandizing of the Holocaust to support the Jewish state of Israel is complex. And
and the thing is, in the context of what we're talking about now, they need to be treated separately. You should be able to say on one hand, the Holocaust is horrible. I believe it was 11 million people total died. 6 million of them are Jews. So a lot of different people are affected by it. That was a horrible event, and there's all kinds of history with it with World War II. What we're dealing with now with a state that happens to have people who are of that same religion running it needs to be treated as a separate issue, meaning they need to be judged on the own morals or immorals that they're doing.
Yeah, because when Israel was founded, there was a couple of key players in the founding of Israel. Obviously, lots of nuance, but the high level is that you need a lot of fucking money to found a country. to fund the fighting involved in this thing. And a lot of that came from the Rothschild family and other wealthy Jewish families around the world. A lot of that money came from fundraising in the United States done largely by mob affiliated people through casino networks and things like that. And a lot of the weapons were old World War II weapons that were smuggled by the Jewish mob in America over to Israel. So you have bankers, some of the worst. And like, let's be clear from the start here. Every Jew is an individual person that should be judged on their individual actions. Right. And when you criticize one Jewish person, you're not criticizing all Jewish people by any means. And when I criticize Israel, I am not criticizing all Jewish people by any means. And lots of Jewish people do not agree with what Israel is doing right now. And some of them agree with Israel conceptually, but not with what it's doing right now. And some of them don't agree with Israel at all. And it's like everyone is an individual, right?
Yes.
And so when you get some of the worst individuals in the world being the funding of this operation, and then you get some of the worst people in the world being the weapons smuggling of this operation, the mobsters, who were also involved in sexual blackmail at the time in the United States with the FBI situation. And then you get a whole bunch of militant groups that were essentially terrorist groups at the time that were both fighting against Palestinian militias as well as bombing British civilians and bombing other civilians in the area to get them all to fucking move out. And the bombing of the King David Hotel is one very famous one of the biggest, most like highest casualty numbers ones.
And just to be clear, and correct me if I'm wrong here, part of the reason before you get to the bombing of any hotels and stuff like that, part of the reason that anger was emanating was because Britain was putting a cap on Jewish immigrants coming into the country.
Britain was trying to essentially like not answer the question, so to speak. Britain had promised Palestine to two different groups directly, and they had teased France a little bit too. So the Arabs had been promised Palestine during the war in order to revolt against the Ottomans, and that was critical to, the war. And then the Jews had also been promised Palestine, and that was super critical to the war. And so Britain had fucked everything up during that time, as they tend to do, fucking empires. And so they had already totally like fumbled the ball in a big way. And so when World War II ends and then Britain is like, I don't want to fucking answer this question. And they kind of halted the immigration into Palestine earlier than that because it had started to get fucking contentious. Yeah. But also, like, once they handed off the decision to the UN to be like, all right, you fucking deal with this problem. I don't want to deal with it. That's kind of cowardly and too. But at the same time, I'm not there. And so then when the partition happens, and I mean, on its surface, my bias to the concept is that when you have a land that has people there living there, and then a bunch of outsiders move into that land, regardless of your traditional, religious, genetic, family ties to it, whatever, regardless of any of that, if you're moving onto someone else's house and their family has been there for the last 2 or 3 or 4 generations, you got to have a little like respect for that. Like, yeah, come on. And so when the partition happens and the Jews are given more percentage of that land than the Arabs, to me, I totally understand why the Arabs are like, fuck no, that's not fair, right? And there will always be arguments about who started the wars. Every single one of the wars, it's always, no, they started, no, they started, no, they started. But regardless, it's
probably
like,
a mixed bag.
Yeah, it probably is, right? But regardless of who started it, they go to war over this partition that the Arabs don't want. And the Jews are like, yeah, we'll take it. Fucking let's go. And in that war, then the Jews come out with way more of the land than the original partition, keep it for a while. And it starts this long history of like, oh, we'll give it back. Oh, we'll take it back in this war that they started. No, they started. No, they. And so through like until the 80s or so, there's this sort of like pre-TV, pre-televised era of this war that is largely just happening over there and being reported on. And a lot of shit happens during that time. And I guess we don't want to get off of the Irgun, the Lehi, and the Haganah too quickly, because these 3 different groups, Irgun, Lehi, and Haganah, there's sort of 3 factions of these militant groups.
Yes.
And Irgun and Lehi are notoriously more militant, more extremist, more down with bombing fucking all kinds of people.
And they're more right-wing, whereas Haganah was aligned with Ben Gurion and the left wing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so they are distinct factions. And obviously it's messy and there's multiple angles to all this. But the Irgun, as one example that's important to note, actually were advocating for an alliance with the Nazis during World War II, not because they, like, as far as I'm aware, loved the Nazis, but because they thought it would be beneficial to the Zionist cause of getting more Jews into fucking Palestine.
What evidence do we have for that?
Documentation. I'm thinking of a very... I think the document I'm thinking of is actually cited in the Wikipedia article about Irgun specifically. And I like sources like that because they're so mainstream and controlled that like if you can make it onto Wikipedia with that, with a primary source like that, it's like, it's relatively there. But there are original documents from the time, like arguments being made by them of like letters, essentially, like we should do this thing. And
meaning they wanted to, I would look at it, if that is the case, they basically wanted to use the Nazi machine to get their ends, and they didn't give a fuck like what was on the other end. They may not like the people, but they're like useful.
Yeah. And like, let's be clear. The Jewish people have been through a lot around the world. Yep. And there's so much trauma around that in the Jewish people and the way that they've been treated by countries and the ways they've been massacred and slaughtered, right? And so I can empathize for sure with the Jewish desire to have a safe place.
Yes.
Right? 100%. And from their perspective, especially coming out of the Holocaust, they are fighting for their lives and for their survival. And they're coming out of an experience that makes it very real.
Oh, right? Can you imagine like just walking out of the woods of Europe? You've been through hell. Somehow you survived it. 90% of your family died. And you get on a boat and you're like, at the end of this boat, I may be on a piece of land that I can actually have freedom on with other people like me. Like, I get it. I totally get it.
Exactly. And so my point around that sketches me out from the start of this story, though, is that the founding leadership is terrorist groups that are willing to bomb civilians to get what they want. And I'm obviously speaking broadly. International bankers that are not great, and mobsters in America that are not great.
So there are three pieces of it.
Those are three key leadership pieces, right?
Would you separate? I'm just like I'm trying to figure out like what all the pieces are here, though. Would you separate those in some way from like the Haganah and Ben Gurion, who were trying to do it more through the UN
the Haganah and Ben Gurion
channels?
Stand out distinctly. And I'm like, there's so much nuance. I would be an idiot to try to claim that I'm like some expert on all of that, all of the happenings of those times. Yeah. And, but certainly it's obvious right from the very first bit of research you do on it that the Haganah is distinct and they did not align with the tactics of a lot of these other factions. And then when Israel is founded, the leadership of Israel, from their prime ministers down to like the rest of their leadership structure, is sort of selected from these various groups, right? And obviously still aligned with these various peoples and things that have formed it. And that's just kind of me speaking logically, not based on any specific factual information, but like if a bunch of mobsters were the best friends that helped get the weapons here, it's not like they're just severing those relationships immediately after it happens. If the Rothschilds funded it, like clearly they are still involved in the project the next year after it's founded. So those interests that founded it are suddenly the top level echelon of people in Israel. And to me, that is the perfect recipe for a deep state. Like that is the ultimate concoction of a deep state right from the start. And Israel is fighting for its survival against these other countries around them from the start in a way that encourages intelligence agency style operations, covert operations, open warfare too. But they're basically like anything goes to save this nation, right? To protect ourselves. And so that is the most fertile soil ever for a corrupt deep state to grow in. And all indication ever since, in my book, shows that a very, very powerful deep state grew in Israel from the start. And lots of Israelis, I think, had nothing to do with it. And I think lots of Israelis were probably totally regular, genuine people. And even Israelis that fought in those wars, I think I'm just assuming, but I would assume there's plenty of people that were wonderful people after that war ended, whatever.
Yeah, you like drawing a little parallel here. Obviously, in every war, there's always some bad apples in the barrel.
War
there
brings it out.
That do some terrible things.
Yeah.
But like, for example, you look at our corruption here in the United States with fucking Iraq and all the shit we did there.
Yeah.
I always have been respectful on our end, as an American too, to like make the distinction between the idiots in D.C. and the offices who are calling those shots and the tip of the spear that they go there and forced to do their job. And I think you're kind of drawing that distinction here in some ways with some of the things they do as well.
Exactly. And when you're looking at the government of Israel, criticizing the government of Israel today, which is what I myself do a lot of, and I'm intentionally always try to draw the distinction that I'm criticizing the government of Israel, not all the people of Israel, and certainly not all the Jewish people around the world. Though I would argue that today a lot of Israelis are raised and propagandized in a way that there's a lot of really horrific videos that come out of Israel because there's a lot of people that align with the sort of like right-wing Likudist kind of mindset about Palestinians that is horrendous and disgusting. But a lot of Israelis today protest what's going on, right? But we're getting ahead of ourselves on that, because during the 60s, 70s, Israel steals nuclear technology from America using these sort of like mob and intelligence agency connections within the United States. It's called the Dimona Affair. There's a couple different names for different parts of it. The Apollo Affair sort of refers to the theft of the nuclear material from NUMEC in America. The nuclear...
it's nuclear something.
Yeah, right.
Don't worry about it.
And that's quite well documented.
Yes, and the CIA proved that, I believe.
Exactly,
yeah.
And Kennedy was very on their ass about it before he got killed. And they steal a bunch of nuclear material. They steal a bunch of technology. They do a crazy deal with France. They build this reactor in secret that they're not supposed to have, and to this day is not official.
Never admitted
it's never been admitted. They have not signed the treaties that everyone else has signed. Super fucked. And Kennedy was on them about it in a big way. And actually, Kennedy was so pissed at them about it that he demanded to inspect the reactor, right? And they set up a fake control room for him to inspect. And they sent the inspectors in, they took him to this fake control room, and they're like, this is fucking fake. And Kennedy, I mean, I don't know how to source whether this quote is real or not. But
they lie to me, and I hate it.
These motherfuckers lie to me constantly, right? Shortly before he died. And I'm not implying that Israel alone killed JFK. I'm implying that there was strong motivations for factions in Israel to support or be a part of or do, whatever they needed to do in that coalition.
That's one I've never seen good evidence for, because the evidence on everything else that had way more power, way more proximity, and a lot to lose, but way less to lose is much more on our own government and the associated acts. Yeah. Now, could Israel have been probably happy the next day after that happened? And, could they send someone to put in a good word and say, hey, if y'all are thinking about this, go for it? Yeah, but like when I see a lot of the cases on the JFK thing, I think they're total house of cards.
I think that the JFK one is one that I think actually Israel had less to do with than all the other coalition elements. I think that if there is any Israel involvement directly in the JFK thing, I think it's actually much more likely and more accurate to say Jewish mob involvement, although mafia really fits the bill a lot better when you actually look at the names of people that were on the ground there.
That motherfucker was hated by a lot of people.
Yeah. I'd be curious if you've ever heard the story. We don't need to get all into Kennedy right now, but I heard that John F. Kennedy basically had a meeting where he sat down with his dad and his mafia buddy. I forget exactly who it was.
Chicago?
Maybe. And they had a meeting where he was basically like, will you play ball? And John was like, yeah, I'll play ball. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And then he basically double-crossed them. Yeah, it was Giancana.
Yeah,
right?
so I believe it was Giancana. Yeah. I don't know the specifics.
I don't know how
of whether or not John was in the room or anything, but I do know, and it's been widely reported that, effectively that was a razor-thin election in 1960.
Yeah.
He won because there were a lot of people who voted in Dallas, Texas, and Chicago, Illinois. And some people who weren't alive. Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.